Hello, everyone. It is another Tuesday. It is February 22nd, 2022 today, and we are here to continue as it is the plan, our Tuesday plan. We are continuing the series of videos on great ideas in psychology. We have reached the fourth chapter, which is titled The Freudian Unconscious. So we are going to talk a little bit about Freud and Freud's idea of the unconscious and why it is an important, significant idea in psychology in general. It's one of the most important ideas. Psychoanalysis in general is an extremely important field of study, but despite its importance, students often are not exposed to it in their academic formal education. So I went through 4 years of undergraduate studies in psychology and 5 years after that, 5 years of postgraduate studies. And my formal exposure to psychoanalysis was zero. My professors, mentors, the classes that were offered, there was almost nothing. There were some courses that were peripherally related to psychoanalysis. I took a graduate seminar on history of psychology with the great Professor Marx that I really enjoyed that course. In that, we had one session devoted to Freud and psychoanalysis. But aside from those exceptional situations, there was no mention. And that's a whole topic. Maybe we can get to that discussion at a different point. So that lack of attention in universities and academic programs to psychoanalysis, the dismissal of psychoanalysis, combined with its importance, makes this part, I think, extra important. So let's begin. Keep in mind, this is a very cursory and very brief introduction to Freud and the unconscious. We are going to just touch on a few elementary points. And hopefully this will trigger your interest and you will begin more serious study of Freud and post-Freudian thinkers. So, Great Ideas in Psychology, Chapter 4, Freud and the Unconscious. This is our place in the general map of our course. This is the thinker, the central figure that we want to pay attention to, Sigmund Freud. But to understand Freud, we need to situate him in relation to a few other thinkers, scientists, writers, philosophers. So these are 5 of those important thinkers that are related to Freud. They have ideas that are similar to Freud in some ways, and in some ways should be distinguished from Freud. There is one person that is missing from this image, from this slide, and we will get to that other person who is also really important. That other person who is missing from this slide is Karl Marx. The reason why Karl Marx is significant in any discussion of Freud is because Freud and Marx are both theorists of conflict, because they both deal with conflict. In the case of Marx, it is a conflict between people, between segments of society, different classes. And in the case of Freud, the conflict is within the mind of individuals. One individual can have conflict in their psyche. But before that, let's just pay attention to these 5 other thinkers, we can say Freud's predecessors. Some of them influenced Freud. In some other cases, it's not clear to what degree they had direct influence on Freud, but we should discuss them. Let's turn first to the thinkers on the left side. We have Gustav Fechner, and the second person is Hermann von Helmholtz. So they had ideas that we can characterize as unconscious mental processes. And to understand Freud's idea, we can highlight the contrast between Fechner and Helmholtz's idea of unconscious, the unconscious from Freud's. So what do these psychologists or physiologists thought about the unconscious? Let's begin with Fechner among the two. Fechner, you might remember from the video in this series, I think it was the second in this series, where we talked about experimentation and the psychological laboratory. We talked a little bit about Fechner and psychophysics. And if you remember that, you'll remember that Fechner's aim was to find laws that connect the physical reality with the psychological reality. How are those two connected to each other? And Fechner, Weber, and the psychophysical tradition found a mathematical description that showed how the physical reality is connected to the conscious reality of experience and perception. Part of that understanding was that there are some changes in the physiological domain that do not cause any change in the psychological domain. So something might change in my physical environment, but I might not consciously perceive it. Let's say I'm going on a short trip and I take a backpack with me, and my wife puts a soda can in my backpack. The soda can is not heavy enough for me to notice it. As I'm still carrying it, the soda can is added to my backpack. But somewhere in my physiology, that additional weight is registered. And there is some activity in my brain that corresponds to that additional weight, even though I'm not conscious of it. So that means that conscious perception, conscious experience requires the activity, the physiological activity, to pass a threshold, to pass the threshold of consciousness. And if it remains below that threshold, if the intensity of the stimulus is not enough, then it remains an unconscious stimulus. It is registered somewhere, but it doesn't become conscious. Then we have Helmholtz, who gave a different view of unconscious processes, and that is a view of unconscious processes of inference. And this refers to the fact that so much of our experience in perception and in thought is not available to us. What we experience are the products of our mental processes. So we, in a sense, we get the outcome, not the process. We don't necessarily get the process. So perception and thought involve the mind working with certain assumptions and working with sensory, perceptual input, what we get from the environment, and drawing certain conclusions based on the assumptions, the unconscious or subconscious assumptions, plus the perceptual input. And that process of inference, Helmholtz argued, is itself unconscious. Helmholtz was, you might not be surprised by this, Helmholtz was heavily influenced by Kant and Kantian philosophy and Kantian categories. So he thought that mental processes should include unconscious inferences and working with assumptions that are not themselves explicit, and we are not aware of them. So some examples. This is a common example of what we see that isn't fully there. So here we have 6 elements that are really, in fact, they are separable elements. But when they are arranged in this way together, you might see, I mean, you're very likely you will see 2 triangles or a star, even though there is no star there, but that there's a process of perceptual inference based on what is there. Our mind reaches the point, reaches I don't want to say conclusion, but it reaches a state in which we see the presence of a whole, a gestalt, based on the elements. So that even if I try to talk myself out of seeing that whole, talk myself out of seeing those triangles or the star, I cannot change my perceptual experience. Here's another example of the Ames room, where in this room, people are given access to the viewing access to the room based on one single hole, so they can only use one eye. And this illusion works only if you have that monocular access to this Ames room to get this illusion, to fall into this illusion. What we see here is the illusion that these 2 kids in the image have drastically different sizes. I think these 2 are the same child, the same girl, I think. But the room is arranged, it is designed to give us an illusion of size, because the room is arranged to hide the fact that there are these 2 sides, the wall that is in front of us, the left side and the right side, have different distances from us. So we don't perceive the correct depth. If you view the room from another angle or with both eyes or from the outside, you immediately see the depth that is different from on the left and on the right side, these different depths. So the judgment of depth is also something that we infer thanks to our unconscious mental processes. We don't reason our way to depth judgment. We don't say, oh, so those, based on those squares, based on the size of those windows, the depth should be equal on the left and right side. And no, that's not, we see what we experience is an immediate, it's seemingly immediate and effortless judgment of depth. So that is what Helmholtz means when he says that those inferences are unconscious. The perceptual, quote unquote, perceptual reasoning, the logic of perception, as Irvin Rock would much later say. The logic of perception is a logic that is followed unconsciously. So we covered so far Fechner and Helmholtz. Now let's turn to two philosophers, two German philosophers. On the right side of this figure, we have Arthur Schopenhauer and Friedrich Nietzsche. There are lots of, arguments over whether Freud read Schopenhauer earlier in his career or at all. How much credit should he give or have given to Schopenhauer? How much credit or debt does he owe to Nietzsche? Those are beyond the scope of our discussion. What matters to us, or what should matter in this context, is the similarities and differences between Schopenhauer and Nietzsche and how they would compare with Freud. I think they are really, really important predecessors for Freud, and their thinking is operating at a different level, different scale. Schopenhauer and Nietzsche, especially Schopenhauer, is thinking about human nature and nature in general. Friedrich Nietzsche is thinking more in terms of human society, human civilization, human culture, and compared to Freud, less so about human individuals, human persons. So let's talk a little bit, like cover a few points about Schopenhauer. So there's this idea of the will that Schopenhauer talked about. The will, the universal will. All living creatures, by virtue of being alive, are driven by this universal will, the will to live, to remain alive, to survive, and to procreate, to have children, to have offsprings. This will is unconscious. So Schopenhauer is also a follower of Immanuel Kant, like Helmholtz, and he stated that the will is what Kant referred to as the noumena. So the will is unconscious, but despite its status as unconscious, it provides the energy that is behind all of our actions and all of our activities and strivings. So for example, you might fall in love, that's a conscious experience. You might want to have sexual relationships, that's also a conscious wish. You might wish to have a family, that's also conscious. But behind all of these conscious wishes that have a plurality, they're very different from each other. Falling in love and wanting to have sex seem very different from each other. But behind all of these is that will, that the will that we share with all other living beings. Now, Nietzsche, who was, regarded Schopenhauer as a teacher, he, in one of his early essays or early books, I think his first major work, The Birth of Tragedy, he talks about two general tendencies in human beings, the so-called Apollonian tendency and the Dionysian tendency. The Apollonian tendency is a tendency, roughly speaking, to design, to plan things, to create architectural design. Or in the case of maybe philosophers and scholars, it is that desire or tendency to find and formulate true ideas. I have a typo here, truth ideas. I think first I wrote truth and then I added ideas, but I didn't correct it. In contrast to Apollonian tendency, we have the Dionysian tendency, which is a more, you can say, wild. It is a wild tendency to live, to dance, to lose yourself, and to feel united with nature, to unite. So Nietzsche talked about how human civilization is the product of both of these tendencies. But with regard to the interplay between what is conscious and what is unconscious, he argued that we give too much credit to, or we are more conscious of, our consciousness is more captured by the Apollonian motive. And we push aside and we give less credit to the Dionysian motive, to the Dionysian tendency. We might say, oh, what a great architect. Look at this calm, well-mannered artist who designed this piece of work, piece of art. And we neglect or we forget the fact that there's some will behind this creation, behind this design. There's a Dionysian will that enables this artistic energy in the first place, the energy that is invested into the Apollonian activity. Nietzsche also criticized, with respect to religion and ethics, he criticized the hidden motives behind our religious and ethical reasoning. Specifically in his book, The Genealogy of Morals, he pointed out how we want to give noble reasons to our actions that maybe are motivated by resentment or by weakness. Okay, against that background, now we have Sigmund Freud. Let me just say that in contrast with Schopenhauer and Nietzsche, Freud gave us an idea or a concept of the unconscious that was personal. That means that unconscious is specific to the individual, and it is rooted in the history, life history of the individual, the experiences of the individual, at least in part. And that is different from that universal will, the universal tendency to hide certain motives or to argue and justify other motives and give a conscious image that has discrepancy from the hidden, latent unconscious forces. So in the case of Freud, those things are still, they still persist in Freudian theory, but we also get this personal, very strong personal dimension. We should keep in mind that Freud lived and worked at a time where it was really important to have scientific rigor and be careful to meet the standards of science, scientific standards. So that is something that people have discussed partly in relation to Helmholtz and Helmholtz's associates. And Freud was really inspired and motivated to meet these requirements of scientific standards, scientific rigor. More specifically, from Helmholtz, he took the concept of energy and the conservation of energy. He recognized that there's a difference between, or there's maybe a language that was indispensable, that was psychological or psychoanalytic. It couldn't be reduced to the language of physiology. And despite that, despite keeping the language of psychology or psychoanalysis, he still retained the concept of energy. So energy, the concept of energy and conservation of energy, channeling of energy, those remained important for Freud. The desire to be scientific also compelled Freud to leave behind, early on in his career, to leave behind a method that he had borrowed from Charcot, the method of hypnosis. Even though hypnosis had proved to be useful in some tasks, like distinguishing psychological disorders from neurological disorders. But he decided to leave behind hypnosis because he wanted to adopt methods that were very clearly scientific. So when he joined Breuer, and together they started their studies on hysteria, they replaced the method of hypnosis with the so-called free association. All right, so far we have talked about Fechner, Helmholtz, a little bit about each one of those individuals, Schopenhauer, Nietzsche. Now let's talk a little bit about Darwin and what major concept Freud took from Darwin. So from Darwin, Freud took the concept of instinct. And the concept of instinct played a major role in Freud's theory of psychosexual development. So what is an instinct? An instinct is a capability, a behavioral capability. The body of an organism is capable of expressing some behavior because that behavior is inherited. And that behavioral capability gives that species selective advantage in access to resources, access to food, or access to safety. Even humans must be equipped with instincts in order to get a chance to survive long enough to learn other non-instinctive capacities like language and culture. So we must have some innate drives. We must be capable of experiencing hunger, thirst, for instance. We are, in addition to hunger, thirst, we are also predisposed to form attachments early on in life. Freud did something to this concept of instinct. He viewed it from within the organism, and he discussed the concept of instinct through the lens of enjoyment. So let's consider the activity of eating or drinking for babies, human babies. Human babies breastfeed, they drink their mother's milk. And doing that takes a lot of energy from the baby. In order to do that, they need some biological justification, and that justification is enjoyment. So to drink the mother's milk, the baby must be able to enjoy breastfeeding. And the enjoyment gives the motive, provides the motivational background for the baby to do it. And then the baby can survive thanks to this instinct. By the way, this is the first stage in Freud's theory of psychosexual development, the so-called oral stage. Now, instincts clearly cannot always be satisfied. Even when they can be satisfied, they cannot be immediately satisfied. So the child will face some obstacles and problems in satisfying the instincts. And these obstacles might lead to fixation at one of the stages of development. So a baby who had some issues with the satisfaction of the oral urge at the oral stage, at the stage where the baby was breastfeeding, some issues with that, some obstacles against that the gratification of that instinct might lead to the so-called oral fixation, that the baby might later, when they grow up, they might express that fixation in terms of maybe smoking cigars. In addition to those sensual fixations, the child also faces the so-called Oedipal complex, which for boys involves competing for mother's attention, competing for the mother's attention with the father. So they might regard the father as a competitor for the attention from the mother, because mother's attention is limited. It's a limited resource. And the Oedipal complex has to become unconscious. It has to be repressed for the successful and healthy development of the baby. There shouldn't be an antagonism between the baby and the person who's providing and supporting the baby's life. The general idea or the general category of obstacles against pleasure and the satisfaction of instinct is the external reality. Freud called this the reality principle and contrasted it with the so-called pleasure principle. And there is a mapping between the pleasure principle and reality principle and conscious and unconscious aspects of the psyche. Approximately, the pleasure principle, the drives, move into the unconscious, or they remain in the unconscious, while the conscious mind, or the ego is the conscious aspect of the psyche, negotiates the demands of negotiates with reality and its demands. So it negotiates between demands of the drives, what drives formulate and want to express the wishes of the body, the instincts, and the demands and realities and limitations of the outside world. Okay, now we get to that notion of conflict. For Freud, that is a conflict between inside and outside, instinct and the limitations of reality, pleasure principle and the reality principle. There are other conflicts. It is important to point out, for Freud, there are also conflicts between drives. So sometimes two drives come into conflict with each other. The conflict is not just between the internal drives and the external drives. The psyche itself is complicated enough to give rise to internal conflicts. The other major theorists of conflict was Karl Marx. Both of these theorists are theories of conflicts similar to Thomas Hobbes, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and other people in this tradition. Marx analyzed conflict with respect to social class. So as as it is well known, Marx discussed capitalist societies and how workers are exploited. Workers, laborers, they are the ones who benefit the least from their work, and they are alienated from their labor. And not just the working class, but other classes, they all fall into what Marx called false consciousness. And because they fall into false consciousness, they become neglectful. They ignore the fact that a group of people are treating another group of people unfairly. And each group is in some sense treating themselves unfairly and not being true to the full human potential. In Freud, the conflict is intrapersonal, it's within the mind. What we want, what we need, what we desire cannot be satisfied. Being civilized, for Freud paid attention to civilization and its effect on the psyche. Being civilized means repressing these basic wants. And we need to negotiate with reality, to be practical, to be patient, to be willing to work and work with others, and be willing to wait. Those are all operations of the ego. And we need to, in addition, we need to follow rules and be good, be ethical. And that is the operation of the superego. Now we get to the idea of dreams and fantasies. So when we sleep, Freud reasoned, when we are sleeping, we are not in contact with the harsh realities of the external world. So the ego is less active during sleep, and our desires can become more manifest. They can show themselves. They can show themselves still in latent forms. The reason why that is latent is, we don't need to get into that. But it's partly because we are not in a position to always understand our desires. And for Freud, we also, the conscious mind needs to protect itself against the traumatic images that are associated with our wishes. So the reason why we get latent forms is itself, or why the manifest level is different from the latent level of the dreams. That's a whole different discussion. What is important for us is that dreams express wishes, and they are true wishes, but they come in the language of symbols. So for the example that you see in the book is the example of a man, let's say David, who is dreaming about another person, a man who is constantly criticizing him. And in the dream, he sees this man dying right in front of him. Even though he gets upset and he says, that's a bad dream. I had a really bad dream. I had a nightmare. Even though that is a nightmare, David, this guy, he categorizes that dream as a nightmare. Freud would still argue that that dream represents a real wish and the fulfillment of a wish on the part of this David guy. So dreams or fantasies erupt into our experiences like volcanic activities. We are surprised by them because they were previously repressed or they were previously unconscious. Movies, stories, works of art, it might be interesting to engage in this kind of exercise. It has a problem of being difficult to falsify, of course, but it is interesting to get used to using this Freudian language. So I have, if you're interested in this, I already have a video on my channel in which I talk about Dan Brown's story that it was made into a movie called Inferno. The book and the movie are both called Inferno. And I talk about what that could mean if we adopt the Freudian lens, the Freudian interpretive perspective. In addition to dreams and fantasies and works of art, there are other signs or symptoms that Freud would say we can analyze. And one of these categories of symptoms or signs are slips of the tongue. These are mistakes. You mean to say something, but you end up saying something else instead. You end up making a mistake. in speech. And for Freud, those mistakes tell a truth about the person, about the subject as a whole, about the psyche as a whole. In the textbook, we read the example of a woman who's talking to a handsome car salesman. And she mistakenly says, yes, I really need to change my husband. Sorry, I mean, I really need to change my car. And I recently was in a seminar where the teacher, the person who was giving the seminar, the professor, was answering a student's question. And after giving some answers, some preliminary answers, he said, oh, I know this is not a very good question. Sorry, I mean, I'm not giving you a very good answer. That could be, we could see that as a Freudian slip. So the point here is that for Freud, slips tell a truth. Not a truth, not about the conscious attitudes, the conscious beliefs, but a truth about the unconscious. Similarly, we have especially in Freud's book, Psychology or Psychopathology of Everyday Life, we get other examples of, everyday life things expressing the reality and the contents of, well, I shouldn't say content, the reality and the processes that exist in the unconscious psyche. So forgetting is one example, forgetting of names, forgetting of birthdays, anniversaries, in addition to slips of the tongue. These point to inner conflict. So you have a friend and you end up forgetting your friend's birthday. Freud would say, what does that mean? Do you secretly hate this friend? I was close to, so this is a story about how I got to Freud towards the end of my graduate studies. I got introduced to this psychologist, British psychologist, Michael Billig, who I was really impressed by. I was really inspired by Michael Billig's work. And I was introduced to him thanks to my friend, Peter Limberg. He has a book that is entirely devoted to Freud. It's called Freudian Repression, Conversations Creating the Unconscious. In that book, Billig talks about how the unconscious is something that is part of the discourse. So it is part of the conversation. In a conversation we create together when we tacitly shy away from a touchy subject, or when we avoid talking about a sensitive topic. For Billig, that is, first of all, that is related to what Freud means by repression. And when Billig's argument is that when we pay attention to Freud's own texts, we get that some evidence that supports that position of the unconscious and conscious, that interplay between conscious and unconscious being mapped to discourse and language and conversation. So it is a more intersubjective, interpersonal process, an aspect of interpersonal linguistic processes. And that Freudian Repression book was, I think, published in 2003. Billig has a more recent book published in 2019, I believe, called More Examples, Less Theory. And that book has a chapter devoted to Freud, Sigmund Freud. Now, I should also talk a little bit about critics of Freudian unconscious, even though our discussion has been really brief and unfairly brief, but we should say a few things about limitations of this. Through a Freudian lens, it is difficult to distinguish or to see how we can distinguish between innocent mistakes and meaningful slips that are revealing the unconscious wishes. The other problem is that any disagreement with Freud will result in or might lead to a Freudian theorist or a Freudian psychoanalyst saying that, oh, you're just resisting. You're just trying to repress this truth. So it is difficult to meaningfully disagree with Freud. Actually, Freud has a chapter in the Penguin Freud Reader in which he precisely addresses this problem. So people who have this criticism of Freud should read that, should read what Freud himself says about this problem. There are also discussions of, I mean, this is a little bit hand-wavy, but there are discussions of how do these Freudian concepts show up in neurology. So people really want to establish what is real with reference to neurological structures and neurological functions. And if you can point to an area of the brain and say, here is the unconscious, or here is when you experience the drive towards food, or this is where you experience thirst. It is thanks to this brain region. Somehow in our time, because of the kind of spirit of the age that we live in, that kind of acts as a very compelling justification for concepts. And the fact that Freudian concepts don't have such neat neurological underpinnings, that is taken as a point against Freud. And there are limits to Freudian view of dreams. And the author of our chapter, the author of this book, talks about some of the useful alternative views of dreams. And those points to cultural differences and the scientific attitudes that are implicit in the Freudian framework. Now, I'm going to mention 3 post-Freudian thinkers that represent extensions to Freudian theory. But of course, I believe that getting into any of these thinkers, it is first essential to spend time with Freud and Freud's own writing. So let's go through these 3 thinkers quickly. One is Melanie Klein, and Melanie Klein's summary of her contribution is that he's insisting on relationships. So he wants to move our perspective from isolated individuals to relationships. So it is not the individual that is repressing, it is the relationship in which something is repressed. It is a relationship that could improve and become healthier. The pattern of the relationship has to change and, not be repeated, not get fixated. It's not the individual alone that gets fixated and repeats patterns. There's Carl Jung, who was an early associate of Freud and then parted ways with him. With Carl Jung, we get the shift from personal unconscious to the collective unconscious that really also expands the meaning of unconscious psyche. It includes archetypes, stories, and other deeply ingrained patterns that Jung argues are part of our part of the unconscious psyche, and they're similar to the instincts in some ways. And we have Alfred Adler, who argued that we should shift from Freudian emphasis on etiology to teleology. So we should, instead of asking, where does this symptom come from? Adler would ask, what is this person doing with the symptom? Why is he getting stuck with the symptom? What is it that this person wants to avoid doing? So for Adler, we should examine the relationship of the person with the present reality. Carl Jung, in some of his writings, also agrees with Adler, but Jung says that we should examine this question on a case-by-case basis. But for Adler, we shouldn't care about the causes of mental problems. We should instead talk about what these mental problems are enabling us to avoid, the obstacles that we create for ourselves to avoid meeting the challenges of life, the tasks of life. All right, I think that is okay for now. Next Tuesday, if everything goes according to plan, we will get to cover chapters 5 and 6 together in one session. So we are going to talk about long-term potentiation, and then that's chapter 5, and then chapter 6, which is learning. I'm going to summarize a little bit more the content of those 2 chapters. If you enjoy the presentation, if you enjoy this series, please support the channel by liking and commenting, by subscribing. And if you would like to more seriously support the channel, please visit my Patreon page, where through that Patreon page, you can also join our reading group and the writers group that is ongoing. We meet several times every month. All right, that's it for now. And until next time.